My name is Herb, and I'm an alcoholic. Welcome to our Big Book Telephone Step Workshop. This call is being recorded. Please join me in an open mind and an open heart. The attitude as expressed in the words of the set-aside prayer. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path in you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Welcome to our call. Today is June 22nd, 2019. It's a Wednesday here and Thursday in some of your areas. We've actually been warming up, having an orientation. It's been a long orientation because it takes a while for us to get a sense of the protocol, certainly, and the rhythm of the call and what's expected, and beginning to learn how to manage our time, to manage the assignments. And I hope that you've got some smoothness now in your weekly preparation and the weekly call, and that it's beginning to feel more organic and more normal. And it will be so over time, more and more. Especially as now we enter into step one. Step one has, by my observation and experience, step one literally has two major parts, a first half and a second half. Well, you've looked at it. It says, admitted we were powerless over alcohol. Now, for our purposes here, we'll substitute the word for alcohol, addiction. Some of you are alcoholics, some of you are drug addicts, some of you are gamblers, some of you are workaholics. Some of you know it and some of you don't. And the whole point of the set-aside prayer is for you to challenge yourself, even so far as to ask yourself, am I really a food addict? Or is it just bad training and bad habits? I'm serious. I'm not asking you to change your 12-step fellowship. I'm not asking you to change your sponsor or challenge that. I'm not asking you to change anything. I'm asking you just to challenge yourself, because we're going to have a series of questions over the next couple months, actually, as we take a deep dive into step one. Yeah, we'll stay in step one for a long while. It's the foundation. Bill uses an architectural analogy. He introduces it in step two, but I'm introducing it here because I know what to expect. He introduces the architectural analogy of a spiritual arch through which we walk to a new freedom. He does so in the second step, where he calls willingness the cornerstone. Having said that, backing back up now to step one, it's the foundation. He doesn't ever say that, but it's implied in his metaphor. A spiritual arch obviously has to have a foundation. And if the willingness in step two is the cornerstone needs to be placed on the foundation. The foundation is a deep excavation. Getting some information, certainly, what is an addiction? What is unmanageability? But more importantly than the information, is having an experience with it, a personal experience with your own personal history, so that you will, in fact, be taken deeper into the darkness and the hopelessness and the desperation. Today, not the memory of yesterday, but today, the realization of no choice, the realization of powerlessness. So step one has two parts. The first half about addiction, but then there's a dash. Please note it's not an and. This is not over-analysis. This is trying to understand the structure of the first step. And why didn't Bill say and? Why did he put a dash in there? Our lives had become unmanageable. What is unmanageability? It's the second half of the first step. But what's its exact nature in contrast to the addiction? Now, it's clear that anybody who has any type of addiction, while they're in it, while they're practicing it, their life is going to be unmanageable. But that's not the implication here. If Bill wanted to join those two thoughts, he would have used an and. He used a dash, which means it's a separate thought. Of course, it's connected, at least in the beginning. Our life will be unmanageable if we're practicing any form of addiction. And maybe even in the early years of our recovery, and I'm saying 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, it might feel that our life is unmanageable as the result of the addiction, and that's probably true. It takes a while to recover and to mature and to recreate ourselves with new habits, living habits. But here I am, 35 years sober today, and not today, but this year. My life is as unmanageable today as it was before I ever came in the program. On my own power, that's the caveat. More about that later, but I wanted to sort of set the context here for step one. And then going back to the first half of the first step, it has two components. And we'll address both of them, but not at the same time. We're going to artificially separate them. There are two questions. What's wrong with my body? And Dr. Silkworth will speculate about that. He has an opinion. And then once we've plumbed the depths of that experience, maybe over 2 or maybe even 3 workshops, then we'll take a look at what is the problem of the mind. And Bill treats that in 20 pages. We're looking currently at assignment number 3, which is all about the problem of the body. So if I were in front of all of you all at once, and I had a whiteboard, I would be putting on that whiteboard number 1, and then I would put the word addiction, and then I would put a dash, and then I would put unmanageability. Maybe you could do that on a piece of paper. Addiction, dash, unmanageability. And then underneath addiction, in an upside down V, oh, I do like this approach. You can see me do that now. I don't have to attempt to describe it. On the one side, put body, and on the other side, put mind. So the addiction has 2 components. There's only 2 components, 2 constitutive parts that make us that identify us as an addict of any kind. In our body, once we engage in our addiction, once we engage in our substance or process, we lose control. Once we start, we cannot stop. And then the mind, once we stop, we cannot stay stopped. The problem with the body, Silkworth says, is that we have an allergy. The problem with the mind is that we have an obsession. We're going to really unpack these at some depth, but it's good to have this frame of reference as a context so that you can kind of hang the information and then perhaps precipitate the experience by understanding this roadmap. Then cross over the dash to unmanageability, and then under unmanageability, draw just a straight line down and put will. So underneath addiction and unmanageability, you will have a line that says body, mind, and will. The first half of the first step is about addiction. The second half of the first step is about unmanageability, which is the spiritual malady. The addiction is a problem. It is just not the problem. The spiritual malady is the problem. Now we're going to artificially, as I said, unpack each of these progressively. We'll look at the body as described by Dr. Silkworth, his opinion, and some material from Bill's story and from Bill himself. And then we will look at the obsession, the problem of the mind. And then we'll take a journey through a couple chapters in the big book, different pages, different paragraphs, to understand at least my approach to unmanageability. It wasn't Bill's intention to approach step one in terms of unmanageability the way I will do it, but more about that later, and I'll give you the rationale for that rather than right now. So the assignment had you read the doctor's opinion, read and highlight Bill's story, pages 1 through 8, and read and highlight pages 17 up to the top of 23. We'll take a couple workshops to unpack and look at each of those pages, because I don't want to overlook anything from the big book, highlighting my highlights with you, and then having you comment or ask yourself questions on each of those pages. So first I'll give you my teaching on it, and then we'll have some dialogue concerning each of the pages with each different person, and we will progress through the doctor's opinion that way. So you really have to ask yourself, if the name of the chapter is the doctor's opinion, and you read it, you highlighted it, what is the doctor's opinion? Sometimes that's a startling question to the people on the ground, because they never connected the two. They saw a title and they read the material and they kind of come up with some ideas. I had you prepare for that reading by looking up allergy and phenomenon and craving and addiction and writing out your own definition. See, Dr. Silkworth is a psychiatrist, was a psychiatrist, a medical doctor with a psychoanalytic training. And he was the head of the ward in Towns Hospital for drug and alcohol recovery. They didn't know much in the 1930s, but he observed, and he was a kind and gentle and compassionate and humane man. And he said, you know, I don't do any science here, and I don't do any statistical studies here, but I make observations, and there's something wrong with these people. They come in, they're bright, they're educated, they're well motivated, they get some information, they get some treatment, they get some therapy, they get some recovery, and then they go out and they drink again. And once they start drinking, they lose control. They have lots of control in lots of other areas. But in the area of alcohol, because that's the addiction that he was looking at, once they start, they cannot stop. See, this is the doctor's opinion. It's about what is it in their nature that gives them no choice once they start. He uses the term craving. This is critical in the sense of understanding the doctor's opinion, and maybe even critical in understanding your own addiction. In the terminology today, the professionals use the terms substance addiction and process addiction. Substance addiction, obviously, alcohol, drugs, and food. Process addiction, everything else, meaning gambling, codependency, pornography, work, exercise. My definition of an addiction is repetitive behavior over which we have no control, which leads to negative consequences. Repetitive behavior over which we have no control, which leads to negative consequences. See, we use the term powerless to name step one, and we use it so often we become brain dead to it. And I believe I have suggested to you that you use alternative vocabulary just to challenge yourself, to wake yourself up to the implications of this word. No choice is my preference. I have no choice. When I begin and I take a drink, something happens in my chemistry, and this is the doctor's opinion now, way before he did any science. The doctor's opinion said there's something wrong with their bodies, and he called it like an allergy. Ask yourself if you have an allergy, and if you don't, not about food or addiction, but some type of standard traditional medical allergy. I have an allergy to cats. If there's a cat been in a room, I don't even have to know it's been there. If the cat has been in the room and then I come into the room, my eyes will tear, my throat will shut off, I can hardly breathe. It's very uncomfortable. It's a bodily, physical reaction to some type of outside stimuli that comes inside, this time through touch or absorption or smell. But I also have an allergy to fresh fruit. I didn't always have an allergy to cats nor fresh fruit. It happened when I turned 30. My body chemistry changed in a very unique way. And when I ate an apple, which I had been eating for 30 years, my eyes closed, my throat closed, I couldn't breathe, and I threw up. Well, I made a decision immediately to wash it and peel it the next time. And the next time I ate the fresh apple, I washed it and I peeled it. My eyes closed, my throat closed, I couldn't breathe, and I threw up. I had 2 bad experiences with fresh fruit, and I concluded that I have an allergy, and I haven't had any fresh fruit since. Thin-skinned fresh fruit. I'm being so specific because it demonstrates I'm not allergic to thick-skinned fresh fruit or grapes or berries. It's odd, but it's my unique chemistry. This is really relevant to food addiction for you guys, because I know there's a commonality. I hear it from you. Generally, it's around flour and sugar. But then there's all kinds of other variations on a theme that are quite individual, which makes it very challenging and very difficult, including quantity, as I understand it. So the doctor uses a term. He says, it looks like people have an allergy to alcohol. And what he means there is, once they put the alcohol in their system, the chemistry of alcohol mixes with the chemistry of my body in such a way that it creates a biological mandate, a biological imperative. He calls it, his terms are, a phenomenon of craving. I had you look up the word craving. And I know my Webster's dictionary said craving is the anticipation of, the desire for. That's not the doctor's opinion. He says the craving never happens until after we ingest the alcohol, or in your case, after you ingest the food, whatever your prohibited food is, comparable to alcohol. After you ingest it, there's a compulsion, a biological compulsion that mandates that you then have more of the substance. In my case, it was periodic, which masked the phenomena from me for an awful long time. It was obvious with my wife. She was a chronic alcoholic in the classic sense, the traditional sense. It happened every time in the last 5 to 10 years of her drinking. She drank every day, and every time she began to drink, she continued to drink, losing control until she passed out. I just concluded it was a terrible case of bad habit and lack of control, because it didn't happen to me every time. But as I got some sobriety and I did a timeline on my drinking, and I looked back over the 20 years of my drinking, I drank from 1964 when I left the monastery to 1983 when my wife went into the hospital and they asked me to stop drinking to support her recovery, and alcohol was removed from me. I hope you're hearing the gift of that for me. I'm so humbled by it and so grateful. I didn't think I had a drinking problem. It never occurred to me. I didn't ask for it to be removed. I didn't pray. I didn't make a decision to stop, and I didn't go to AA. I was willing to stop drinking to support her recovery, and February 20th was my last drink. February 21st, 1984 is my sober anniversary. I went to AA a couple months later. That's a story for a different day. And that began my journey in the 12-step culture. But I was alcohol-free and free of the desire for alcohol. I was placed in a position of neutrality at the very moment. It's not an untypical, but it's also not a typical experience. It's not untypical that people go to their first meeting and have the same experience, or go to their treatment program and they have the same experience. I can't explain the periodic part. Why didn't it happen every time, like my exposure to cats and fresh fruit? I don't know why. And it really actually doesn't make any difference. But I wanted to illustrate that there may be two different dynamics here. One is the chronic, that it happens every time, and the other is the periodic, that it happens only periodically. What I noticed in my timeline, though, from 1964 to 1984, I'll just round it out, the progression of the periods got closer as time went forward. Every 5, every 10 years, if I got drunk once a month, the next period I got drunk twice a month, the next period I got drunk once a week, the next period I got drunk 2 or 3 times a week. And so progressively I deteriorated, and I was on my way to becoming chronic. There's no doubt in my mind. The point here, the real clear point for me, and I hope it will become for you, is that Dr. Silkworth is using the term the craving in a very different way. You won't find it in a dictionary. The craving begins after you take a drink. The craving begins after you have the first bite. The craving is a biological craving, not a psychological craving, not a conscious craving, not an emotional craving, not a feeling craving. Emotional craving, feeling craving, those are what the dictionary is talking about in terms of the anticipation. I woke up this morning in some loose sense, I had a craving for a cup of coffee. I have a cup of coffee every morning. I had my cup of coffee and that satisfied the craving. That's the traditional Webster's Dictionary definition of craving. That's not what the Dr. Silkworth says. And you have to ask yourself, what happens when you take a bite of food that is the prohibited food? I'll use that terminology. It may not be politically correct, but for me, I don't want to stumble around with a lot of vocabulary. It sets up a chain reaction. It triggers a chain reaction. What's that about? If the doctor's opinion about alcohol is valid for the experience of food, it means that the food has a chemical content that mixes with your chemistry that explodes in your system, and your cellular structure demands more of that chemical ingredients. Now, science in alcohol has demonstrated that the liver of an alcoholic is different than livers of 9 out of 10 people in North America. 1 out of 10 people are like me. Their livers process alcohol in a unique way that converts the chemical of alcohol through the chemistry of my body into acetone. And the acetone goes into the cellular system. And then the cellular system demands more alcohol. That's the craving. It's a cellular, biological, physiological craving. Now, do you get the power of that in terms of no choice, powerless? It's not about consciousness. It's not about thinking. It's not about morals. It's not about habits. It's not about desire. It's not about willpower. It's not about information. It's chemistry. I put the chemical alcohol into my body chemistry, and the combination creates a physiological craving. This is what the Dr. Silkworth's comments are, or intent is with that. So going to Roman numeral 25, now I'm going to go through some of the pages so that we can take a look at confirming my interpretation. This is the doctor's opinion. He has more than one opinion in his letter, but this is the primary intent. And Bill had asked him to write a letter for the first publication, the first printing of the big book, and he did write, in fact, there were 2 letters. The first one is To Whom It May Concern on Roman numeral 25, and then the second part of it picks up on Roman numeral 27. He was so concerned about his professional standing that although he wrote the letter and allowed it to be printed in the first printing of the big book, he would not sign it. He did not put his name on it. No, I mean, Alcoholics Anonymous was so new, and alcoholics were held in such disrepute in society that he didn't want to be associated with alcoholics. He gave them the letter, but he wouldn't sign it. At some point later on, of course, he did allow them to put his name on it, and Bill removed the doctor's opinion from the Arabic numbers. It was originally page 1, and put it into Roman numerals. That's just a side mechanical thing. So now the book starts with Bill's story, page 1. The doctor's opinion is in the Roman numerals. And the story is that Bill wanted the textbook of AA, pages 1 to 164, to be written by alcoholics not by anybody non-alcoholic. And that seems to be a fairly decent interpretation. On Roman numeral 25, he says in that third line, this is a plan of recovery. This is Bill's comment, a plan of recovery. Think about blueprint. This big book is a blueprint. It's an architectural analogy. It's showing us how the program is built specifically. And it says about alcohol and drug addiction at the bottom of that. Now, it also confirms that it was Bill's third treatment that year, 1934, in which Bill had this experience where he got free of his alcohol, as I've mentioned before. He was hospitalized in September and then November and then December of 1934. He had also been hospitalized the year before once in 1933. So he had had a lot of effort at drying out and recovery. But it was in 1934, in the fall, that he met Ebby Thatcher, who introduced him to the Oxford group. And it was in there that Bill got introduced to the 6 steps of the Oxford group. And Ebby took on the sponsorship responsibility. And when Bill got drunk and went to the hospital for the final time, Ebby came to meet him, worked the steps on his second day of hospitalization, December 12th, and on the third day of hospitalization, December 13th, he had his spiritual mountaintop experience, both of which the working of the steps is on page 13 and the spiritual experience is on page 14 in Bill's story. And we'll look at that later on when we're looking at step 2. He does say at the bottom of that last full paragraph, this man and over 100 others appear to have recovered. Again, reinforcing the term that I had described from the title page of the big book, how 100 men and women have recovered. We're referring to the first half of the first step here, meaning that the addiction, the alcohol problem, has been removed through the step process, through the plan of recovery. In step 10, Bill says we're placed in a position of neutrality. The obsession and the allergy are irrelevant because we're invulnerable, because we have a spiritual shield. I like the image of Star Wars, where there's the starship that has a shield around it, and as long as the shield is there intact and engaged, the starship is invulnerable to being attacked. But if the shield is weak spotted or up, meaning not in force, then we're vulnerable to attack of the obsession. We never have an experience of the allergy unless we have an obsession. We're looking at the allergy right now, what happens when we put it in us. But the real question is, oh, why do we put it in us? And the answer is the obsession and the delusion, which we'll come to in a minute. No, in a couple assignments, workshops. On the next page, Bill says, the physician gave him a second letter so that he would expand on his views. He said, the body of the alcoholic is quite as abnormal as his mind. So the physician himself, Dr. Silkworth, was the one that gave us both these descriptions, a problem with the body, a problem with the mind. But Silkworth really spent most of his time talking about the body, which stands to reason since he is a medical doctor, although he is a psychiatrist, and he makes this comment that we were maladjusted to life, that we were in full flight from reality or outright mental defectives. Now, what he means by that is that we're susceptible in a very unique and individual way, we're susceptible to an obsession. Most normal people learn from negative consequences. You're probably on this line because you didn't learn from negative consequences. We all get beat up pretty badly because of the insanity. We try to do something over and over again, thinking that each time it will be different. Maybe we're in such insanity and denial that we think it's actually going to be better. And it never is better. It is always different, and usually it's worse, but we don't connect the dots. So the problem in the first half of the first step is that we put the substance or engage in the process so that our body chemistry reacts, whether that be my liver in the case of the alcoholic or my brain technology in the case of process addiction. Whatever it is, once we start, we cannot stop. So Bill says on page 23, well, just stop it then. Why don't you just stop it? If just stopping were the issue, then we wouldn't be sitting here today and Bill wouldn't have written a book. The problem is we can stop, and we stop regularly. We just can't stay stopped because we're vulnerable to the obsession. We're vulnerable to the thought. We'll talk more about that as we go down into the next assignment, but you can see the interplay here. We're looking at the body, which is the basic and the most simple form of the reason that we have an addiction, is because our body chemistry is different. We haven't identified it clearly yet, scientifically, in terms of the brain functionality, but there's lots of indication that that's really where it stands. He says the bodies are sickened as well. The theory that we have an allergy to alcohol interests us. He talks about having the person's brain cleared first before he is approached. And what he means is detox. He doesn't mean abstinence. He's talking about detox at the level that somebody can, in fact, process information and take actions that are suggested actions. A better chance of understanding and accepting what we have to offer, he says on Roman numeral 27. So he's talking about ideas that were developed by these people based on Bill and the other people that followed him. When they came back to the hospital to help other people, they told their story about their problem with alcohol, that once they started, they could not stop, and once they stopped, they could not stay stopped. And they talked about the 6 steps of the Oxford group that connected them to a power then that began to neutralize that obsession, which had hijacked them. He says the unselfishness of these people, as we have come to know them, the entire absence of profit motive and the community spirit, they believe in themselves and still more in a power which pulls chronic alcoholics back from the gates of death. I'm on Roman numeral 28 now, freed from the physical craving for alcohol. What he's talking about there is the Webster's Dictionary. He's talking about the habit. 4 o'clock in the afternoon cocktail. If any of you are or have known any alcoholics, once you establish a habit of drinking, then right around the time that you would normally drink, you begin to have craving in the sense of the Webster's Dictionary. a desire for a drink. But that's just habit. That's psychology more than it is biology. The message which can interest and hold these alcoholic people must have depth and weight. Their ideals must be grounded in a power greater than themselves if they are to recreate their lives. This is a promise here. It's not just a statement, but it's a promise that if in fact we ground ourselves in a relationship with a power other than ourselves, we will recreate our lives. And that's the promise Bill gives us, of course, in the third step when we said we are reborn, and this is only a beginning. So Roman numeral 28 says men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol, that reduction in the tension, that sense of ease and comfort. I also like the taste of alcohol. The sensation is so elusive that while they admit it is injurious, they cannot after a time differentiate the true from the false. To them, the alcoholic life seems the only normal one, especially when you're surrounded in family or friends with other alcoholics or heavy drinkers. They are restless, irritable, and discontent. That's why we approach our addiction to get that sense of ease and comfort he talks about on the next page. Notice what he says, though, in the third line. After they have succumbed to the desire, the phenomenon of craving develops. Listen to the sequence. And the reason this is important is some people think that the doctor's opinion is about the craving that they feel, that they're aware of, that they're conscious of, their biological taste buds or their psychological desire for. And that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about, the doctor's opinion's talking about the biochemical reaction that happens once you take the drink, once you take the food, once you put the bet down, or maybe even make a decision, get in a car and start driving toward the casino. Once you do that, the biochemistry is changed in such a way that all hope is lost at that point. There is no calling a sponsor. There is no going to a meeting. There is no prayer. Once the chemical interaction with the chemistry is happening. This is repeated over and over. And unless there's an entire psychic change, little hope for any recovery. So then he talks about the psychic change, of course, where you're easily able to control the desire for alcohol with only a little effort. Well, that's very relative. Being that required to following a few simple rules. Well, he really would have probably been better served by talking about suggestions. All right, so down at the bottom again, just to reinforce my interpretation here, it's pretty clear, he says in the third line from the bottom, they took a drink a day or so prior to the date, and then the phenomenon of craving at once became paramount. After you take the drink, after you take the bite, they are drinking on the next page, Roman numeral 30, to overcome a craving beyond their mental control. This is the biological imperative. He says the phenomenon of craving caused some people the supreme sacrifice rather than continue the fight. My interpretation of that is suicide. It's especially true in alcoholism. I'm not so sure it's true in the food area, but I can see that it could in fact lead to that level of hopelessness and desperation, that there's no light, there's only darkness. He gives us a sense that there are different kinds of alcoholics. I'm not going to go through those different kinds. There's a section in the, I think it's the family afterwards, or to the wives on page 108, that talks about 4 different stages in the progression of alcoholism. And you might want to take a look at that to see if, number one, it's your experience, and number two, perhaps it's an experience of somebody that you're connected to. It's a very nice and clear description. These types are entirely normal, except in the effect alcohol has on them. They have one symptom in common on Roman numeral 30. Once they start drinking, they develop the phenomenon of craving. And the only relief is entire abstinence. Now, that's a wonderful recommendation. Just stop it. Except that it leaves out the other aspect of addiction. We can stop, but we can't stay stopped. Most alcoholics, he says at the bottom, chronic alcoholics are doomed. On Roman numeral 31, he talks about another opinion, a different kind of opinion. He said somebody accepted the plan outlined in this book and he got free of his alcohol. The next half of the page talks about a different situation where the person was hopeless, hidden in a deserted barn and going to die. It's a different situation. And on the next page, Roman numeral 32, it says, this person became sold on the ideas contained in this book and he got free of his alcohol problem. So he's giving now 2 examples, which may in fact be sort of a sub-opinion, if you will. His first opinion is clear. It's a scientific opinion based on his knowledge, not based on his experimentation, just on his observation. That once you start, you cannot stop. And he gives it the terminology of an allergy and a phenomenon of craving. But here he has another opinion. He's got 2 cases that are very clear to him. They became in contact with these people who were in contact with the Oxford group, who were in contact with AA, who read this book and got free. So his bottom line in the last paragraph may be his second opinion. Read the book and stay to pray. It's very interesting that a scientist, a psychiatrist, a medical doctor in 1934, this book was published in 1938, but he was treating Bill through 1934 and other people through 1937 when Bill was writing this book, that he would come to the conclusion where he actually would use the term pray. He wouldn't put his name on it in the beginning, but he had enough courage and enough belief in the credibility of Bill and his associates to include this aspect of their recovery. I'm going to stop there. And for next week, I would like you to read and highlight pages 1 through 8 of Bill's story, the balance of assignment 3, and we will give it a short summary of the highlights of it, and then we will also take a look at the beginnings, at least, of pages 17 through 23, which is then Bill's commentary on rounding out the approach to the problem of the body. And it's toward the end of the assignment to take a look at the worksheet in the Way of Life document on the body. Yeah, page 15 in the Way of Life document. And it's not a test. This is an exercise to prompt you to ask yourself questions about your experience with your addiction or with anything else that you suspect might be a problem. It wouldn't be unusual for us to be multi-addicted and not be aware of a second or third addiction. But answer the questions and become conscious of your behavior. The questions are for you. Pray that set-aside prayer. Be radically honest with yourself. Ask the question and hold the question in the milieu of that set-aside prayer. Go back over your history. It was very important for me to do a timeline, a bullet point timeline of my history of drinking. When did I start? What happened? 12 years old, 15 years old, 24 years old, 28 years old, 31 years old. There were different, very major events which I hadn't remembered ever. And here I am, 43 years old, writing these down. And then I read them out to somebody, and it cracked me open enough that I saw that I had a problem. I didn't conclude that I was alcoholic because I didn't even know what that meant. But at least for the very first time, I agreed that I had a problem. And you might want to do that just to identify for yourself what your experience is. Here's the question, though. The key question for this part of the exercise. What happens when you start? Not before you start. What happens after you start? Do you lose control? Do you lose control every time? Do you lose your control periodically? Is it different with different foods or different substances? Is it different with different processes? Take a look at your life. Do you have any repetitive behavior over which you lose control, which produces negative consequences, and it's happened more than 2 or 3 times in your life? Huge, big question. Very confronting, very challenging. It may be that you have only one addiction. It may be that you have more than that. And it may be that it's been developed over time. Keep yourself open, like with the spirit of the set aside. All right. Thank you so much, everybody that shared today. And you guys are the guinea pigs because we're just starting this journey. And let's pray the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. We've begun the journey. Step 1 is begun. Thank you, everybody.